challenges of food with a population heading towards 9 billion down the road apiece. Energy, both the composition of our energy and the technologies that might emerge as we strive to address climate change, but also the siting of energy, wildlife issues, biodiversity losses. Then, of course, climate, which touches anything and everything and has implications for economies, for safety. So lots of global challenges that must be informed by science and new technologies. When we think of those challenges, they're often the stuff of headlines. There are lots of awareness gaps and really, as Todd noted, difficult decisions, no clear pathway to forward motion in many cases, but in every case, science is essential to good decisions. I like to start by reminding people of something that Todd alluded to, which is that often the scientist and the policymaker, decision maker, start with different mental models. So the scientist often asks, how does the world work? The decision maker is really looking at what values and goals are we pursuing and how. You can look, for example, at the conversations right now unfolding in the US Congress about infrastructure. And some people really highlighting basic infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, wastewater treatment. Others saying, well, wait a minute, infrastructure is much broader than that, or at least important value sets are critical. For example, issues about equity and inclusion, our housing stock, housing in particular for disadvantaged communities. So how do all those play out? How do you prioritize and put what money to where? And so those are the kinds of things a policymaker will often ask. The scientist is saying, gosh, what do we know about the world around us? So when I think about science and decision making and sort of bridging science and bringing it into action, I think of three different elements that are really important to consider. One is the nature of the challenges. The second is the decision setting itself. There's no one decision making. I'll dive into that a little bit more later. And then there's the people factor. So no matter what we know from a science standpoint, or indeed what value sets a policymaker might have, there are the challenges of how people learn, their cognition, how people take science information and incorporate it into their own thinking and decisions. So let me start with the nature of the challenges. This touches on something that Todd highlighted in his opening comments. We have interconnected complexity. We have change. The setting itself is dynamic. Knowledge is dynamic. We see this, for example, as Dr. Fauci has communicated to us over the last year on health issues. There was a little bit of knowledge about the COVID-19 pandemic and what we know about it a year ago. A lot of knowledge has accumulated over time, but more knowledge still accumulating. But that dynamic knowledge is true of all decision settings. Science itself is a perpetual discovery process. We are not at an endpoint. We're always trying to explore more to know and to know more. Then, of course, there's uncertainty. So complexity itself, constant change, those combine together to mean that we have incomplete and ambiguous information, limits on predictive capacity. Think of the butterfly effect and chaos theory. There are some things that we really just don't know or have really a good way of knowing in a predictive sense. And then, of course, the challenges that we face unfold at multiple scales of problems and actions. So for climate, are we looking globally? Are we looking regionally? Are we looking nationally? Are we looking within a particular community or right on the ground in a particular place? The kind of science one needs varies depending upon the scale of what one's looking at. Dr. Sui, Dan, noting GIS technologies and information systems and geospatial information, very much understands that the scale of the problem you're trying to address really affects how one mobilizes those tools. So those things complicate science and decision-making and their interface. But I want to give you an example of my own direct experience in this context and talk about, while I was at the Interior Department, a decision we had of whether or not to list the polar bear as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. This was a notable decision because it would come to be the first decision about whether to list a species or not, where the primary threat was climate change. And that decision making unfolded with tremendous complexity, multiple knowledges that were important, changing circumstances, lots of uncertainty. And so just to give you a small glimpse at what was a long process involving hundreds of people, just a quick glimpse on some of the science data gaps and uncertainties that we faced as we made this decision. First of all, there were model variations, at least 19 different global circulation models projecting what sea ice would look like on into the future. So how do we think about all of those, and how do we land on what we think is reasonably likely to occur in the foreseeable future? There were questions about natural versus climate causation of ice melting. Bear population status, 19 different bear populations. We knew nothing about 5 or 6 of them. But for the remaining, some of the populations were going up, some of them were going down, some of them were staying stable. Very little knowledge about the link between bear health and sea ice. So we knew some stuff about sea ice melting. We knew some stuff about bear health, but we didn't have a lot of knowledge that connected those two so that we would understand how sea ice melting would actually affect bear health, bear productivity, and so forth. We didn't know a lot about bear adaptability to different conditions. We knew some. For example, we knew that on land, they expended more calories pursuing a fox as food than they actually would take in caloric value. And we knew a little bit about bear response during other warming events, but many gaps. And guess what? The challenge of the decision maker, we had to fill or reduce those gaps in 9 months. Now, as scientists or those studying to be scientists, you know, yikes, a lot of this stuff takes a long time and 9 months is short. That's all the time we had to try not to fill the gaps, but to reduce the uncertainties. Because, by the way, no matter what decision we made, it was going to end up in court. We would be sued whether we listed, or we would be sued by a different set of people whether we didn't list. So we needed the best knowledge we could, explicated in the best possible way, and describing the uncertainties as well as what we did know. And so, you know, ultimately, the keys to effective decision-making for us were to first, working with the US Geological Survey and other scientists, really explain the legal requirements. So there are terms in the law that say foreseeable future, things like reasonably likely to occur. Those are not science terms. So what do those mean, and how do they affect the information that we needed? So in that 9-month period, we first at the very beginning sat down with US Geological Survey and engaged in a co-framing of the key questions. What were some of the biggest gaps that we might be able to reduce the uncertainties around within that time frame? But once having done that, we needed a wall between us and the science that was undertaken. So US Geological Survey developed an independent work plan, a wall between us, the decision makers, and them, the scientists. Then they did their work, they came in and they briefed us on their findings, and ultimately that led to a final regulatory decision. We did decide to list the bear as threatened. There's a lot more detail to that, but I really just wanted to highlight a little bit about the complexities and process. So it was a textbook example of the intersection of science, law, and policy. And frankly, the decision absolutely could not have been made without extensive, extremely sophisticated, very interdisciplinary science. But let me give you a very different kind of example. All around us, we're seeing the effects of a changing climate. We're seeing desire for enhancing resilience. And we at the Nature Conservancy are saying, how can nature help? And so we're looking at things like floodplain restoration, places where we see frequent high intensity storms, increased inundation and flooding. Is there a role for nature to help by having some floodplain restoration? But thinking about that, a lot of complexity, many knowledges and many scales. And so there are performance issues. Well, how do floodplains work? How do they work relative to, say, old-fashioned levees? What about the value? That is, what's the cost effectiveness of, let's say, floodplains as a flood risk reduction versus, say, investing more in more traditional levees? Enabling conditions. Gee, there's a lot of people that live there that experience that flooding. What do they feel about floodplain restoration? How might that affect their backyards, their livelihood? So if you think about it, this examination requires ecology, hydrology. If you're near the shore, oceanography, engineering, critical. How do, for example, engineered and natural systems work together? Environmental economics. What's the benefits of, let's say, a nature-based solution, thinking not only about flood risk reduction, but are there biodiversity benefits? How does one calculate that? The social and behavioral sciences that are all about effects on people and how to understand them, broader economics, political science, what are the institutional barriers, etc. So again, key questions: where and when do habitats help reduce risk and provide other benefits? Value: what are the economic and non-economic values of these services to businesses and communities? And enabling conditions: what behaviors, practices, policies need to be encouraged or changed? And one of the things we like to think about at the Nature Conservancy when we think about nature-based solutions is, golly, there's always a lot of gray defenses already there. And by the way, they have a role. So how do we understand how nature-based and gray defenses work together? What's most cost effective? What mix of those solutions? So trees and floodgates and rock groins and restored marsh and so on and so forth. How do you put that whole picture together? And that requires transdisciplinary. It requires engineers. It requires people with nature knowledge and so forth. So I want to summarize the nature of the challenges and strong systems approach, linkages to real decisions, and then how to strengthen linkages to insights from behavioral sciences. How do people learn? How do people uptake knowledge so that they actually embrace the suggested solutions? How do we strengthen an understanding of institutions, incentives, and governing processes? The great news for your STEP program is it looks like it's going to cover all of those. So Todd, I'm looking forward to signing up. But I want to move to the second pillar of thinking about the intersection of science and decision making. And that is the nature of decision making. I find a lot of times when I talk to certain people coming out of certain disciplines, that there's a tendency to think decision making is one thing. It's maybe passing a law or maybe creating a regulation. But there are actually many different decision types. There's intersecting dynamics and there's challenges of time, space, and scope. So I want to just briefly run through this with a little deeper dive. So think about decision types. There's budgets and funding. So you look at the Congress, it's trying to put money into the national budget. What does it prioritize? Where does science fit? Should we be funding R&D for technological developments for example, new climate solutions? There's making laws. What might a national climate change law look like? Should it be a clean energy standard? Should it be carbon pricing? What goes into thinking about that? What knowledge and information is important? What kinds of analyses? They're setting standards. So you're in EPA. How clean is clean enough? How risky is too risky? There's resource planning and management. So think about that floodplain. You're on the ground in a place trying to figure out how to manage that better. You're at Everglades and Everglades restoration. You're out in the Northwest in the Puget Sound thinking about restoring interconnectivity of water systems, for example. Those place-based decisions, very different decision context than, let's say, setting standards at EPA or budgets and funding and so forth. And then there's decisions about risk assessment and management. Think of offshore Gulf and oil and gas development. How risky is too risky? How do you do that risk assessment, especially for things like the Deepwater Horizon incident? Low probability event, but extremely high consequence. Is historical look at risk really the right framing? And then there's intersecting dynamics. I alluded to this in the polar bear. So there's the laws and the regulations. What do they say? There's bodies of science, but there's the marketplace too. There's cognition and cultures, there's technologies, all of those interplay. They present constraints, they add complexities, and they involve competing narratives. So I borrow this chart from a guy, Gerard McMahon, who has been director of the Southeast Climate Science Center, and he was looking at the interface between science and decision-making and the different kinds of interactions that occur along the continuum from foundational science, those real fundamental questions, how does the world work, to, at the other end of the continuum, that place-based resource management. And, when you're just trying to understand global circulation models and what goes in them and sea level rise and so forth, you're more at the foundational end of the spectrum. And you may not necessarily be at that level, be engaging in sort of collaborative dialogue with stakeholders. But then you move down to, say, coastal vulnerability. You're starting to invoke questions about, gee, what do people care about? What risks are of most concern to them? And so that starts to invite the relevance of collaboration, for example. And then right down to that place-based management, say Miami-Dade building out its resilience plan and its coastal restoration and infrastructure design plan. Golly, that is not going to work unless you're not working with the Department of Transportation, the Department of Parks and Recreation, local community groups, particularly people with in disadvantaged communities. How are those decisions going to affect them? So if you think about it, foundational science, you're really kind of illuminating knowledge. And so the key issues are really those of translation. How do I take this complex stuff and help people understand what it is I'm saying? Perhaps go from the numbers, as I saw in a little quote on one of the slides that Todd put up, to the stories. Timeliness is one generating the knowledge in a timeliness that's relevant for the decisions at hand, and then of course relevance. And so how do you transfer that knowledge to the decision maker? Example of that in an experience I had when I was at Interior is after post-Katrina, 2005, huge hurricane, lot of discussion about restoration, about risk reduction. And that was a time when nature-based solutions were hardly understood. And so US Geological Survey, other scientists began to just at that foundational science level, try to put on people's radar screens, guess what? Coastal wetlands play an enormous role in wave attenuation. Coastal oyster reefs, coastal coral reefs, an enormous role in wave attenuation and risk reduction. So it was really about putting a concept and knowledge on people's radar screen so they could begin to think about it as a potential solution set. But then at the other end of that continuum, actually applying science and technology for resource management, there you've got the decision makers. What direction do we go with all the options that we might have? You've got the science and the technological insights and knowledge, but then you've got the public. And as I noted in the Miami-Dade example, here you're moving from transfer of knowledge to actually co-development of the problem set. What is it that people care about? What are the problems you're trying to solve? And how do you then, with that problem framing, bring to bear the relevant science, the possible technological solutions? So science and resource management invokes questions about how are those problems defined and priorities developed? How is relevant information identified and generated? And by the way, here I like to remind people, yes, there's science knowledge, but there's experiential knowledge, the knowledge of time, place, and situation. So that farmer in that floodplain has a lot of knowledge about his circumstances or her circumstances and place that could be relevant to thinking about what floodplain restoration might actually be doable. How is that science and decision-making discussion conducted? How is information used, tested, and augmented? And how are you adjusting decisions over time because information constantly evolves? The solutions that you undertake, you got to look at them. Are they working? Are they doing what you expected? Or do you need some course corrections and adjustments? I want to remind people that framing of the problem and defining decision boundaries are significant considerations, and they are not simply for science and technical determination. They really do require those affected by the decisions, those making the decisions, those within institutions that will have to expend money to help in that framing and defining of the boundaries. So mutual learning becomes really important. How are dialogues initiated, structured, and sustained? How are the results of collaboration affirmed as public policy and formal management decisions? How do you bring people in? And one of the things we find is that the earlier you engage people in that science decision-making interface, the more likely uptake of the solution sets there will be. And then there's this other challenge. How can you provide meaningfulness in a context of complexity while providing simplicity in a context of management constraints on time and resource? Again, drawing from my time at the Interior Department, we have the perennial challenge of catastrophic wildland fire and how to improve forest health and bring about risk reduction for those catastrophic and unnatural fires. Many systems are fire adapted ecosystems. Fire is part of the landscape, but not some of the kinds of fires we're seeing in recent history. So when I was at Interior, we worked with some scientists to say, gee, we're going to go in and do some fuels treatment, do some forest thinning. How do we assess forest health and what's working, what's not? How do we assess risk reduction? And initially, the scientists came back with 189 metrics. I remember the number, and I'm like looking at it and thinking, oh my goodness, our managers on the ground that we can't measure 189 things. And so you've got to think about what's meaningful. Everglades restoration, lots of dynamics there, but how can you have a dashboard of key indicators and proxy indicators that help you assess, are you going in the right direction, and enable you to measure stuff at a level that's actually doable. So just an example of how a lot of this comes together, the issue scoping, the conduct, the employment of technical and scientific information to define problems. So we're going to go out to California for a moment, Tomales Bay. And here for years, there were debates about some water quality problems in the bay. And some people said it's wastewater treatment plant, and some people said it's the dairy farms, and some people said it's atmospheric deposition from something else. And so there were all these sort of data battles and debates, and everybody kind of putting forward bits and pieces of certainly good science, but no uptake in terms of framing the problem and being able to come to some conclusion on what interventions, what decisions might play out. And so getting a little tired of years of data battles and debates, US Geological Survey used what they call joint fact-finding, and they convened a collaborative process of scientists and stakeholders. And they said, what do you care about? What are the questions you have? What's the science we have? How relevant is that science to helping us understand? Is it the wastewater treatment plants or the dairy or deposition or whatever? And with that, the scientists developed some additional sort of research protocols and went in and did some additional work, out of which came some illumination that helped answer the questions people had. The interesting thing is, this resulted in people moving beyond those data battles and starting to look at solutions, saying, aha, we see that this seems to be the nature of the problem or the composite nature of the problem. These seem to be some of the interventions and solutions and decisions that we need to take. So enhancing mutual learning was really important at Tomales Bay, and something we're now seeing replicated in lots of places. That joint fact-finding, better understanding of the causation of water quality in that particular case, which then led to a focus on problem solving. I'm just going to scurry past this. I want to emphasize the importance of collaborative adaptive management. Often when we're at this resource management level, there are dynamics, there are changes. The interventions and decisions we take do not, as I said a moment ago, always yield the outcomes that we think. And so there needs to be collaborative and ongoing process to continue to look at the goals we had, look at the actions, evaluate and monitor the results, and then collaboratively revise actions. By the way, in many public sector decision settings, it is that monitoring and evaluation piece that is often missing. A lot of people want to dive in for the solution and say, okay, we did it, we're done. But the fact is that monitoring and evaluation, critically important if we're really going to look at results. So decision setting, summary of key needs, strengthening coordination across ologies, transdisciplinary, but also between scientists and policymakers and relevant publics. That transdisciplinary knowledge critical, and then that ongoing learning. It's not the case that we have our knowledge, we make a decision, okay, done. So let me say a few words and then I'll wrap up on the people factor, sort of thinking, learning, behaving, and communicating. So increasingly, social scientists and cognitive psychologists are doing a lot of looking at how do people learn. This is particularly relevant as we look out recently across the globe and in the US, and the seeming imperviousness of some people or in some dialogues to information. And so a guy named Goodman Hermes has sort of developed the phrase and the idea of hot cognition, that instead of our old-fashioned thinking that seeing is believing, show the facts, then we believe, that in fact, oftentimes believing is seeing. That is the context, the cultural context in which you operate, your peers, what they think, what they believe, often play a big role in how permeable your thinking is and how open you are to information. And so, what do you do about that? Well, this again brings me to some social sciences information that we're beginning to see develop around the role of collaborative processes and how they actually influence learning and attitudes and behaviors. That is bringing people together like I described at Tomales Bay. So there's co-learning, mutual development of what the problem set is, has the way of engaging people and cutting through that hot cognition and starting to allow for conversations that begin to center around facts, around science, around decision options. Of course, always importing the questions about values and what people care about most and so forth. Super important in those conversations to understand that decisions have distributional effects. You know, one of the things in the climate realm, as people have proposed carbon pricing and cap and trade systems is that for many in the environmental justice community, they've been deeply concerned that cap and trade means, okay, you got a coal-fired power plant in my backyard, you're going to allow cap and trade and offsets. Gee, it's pretty expensive for me to bring my emissions down. I'm just going to, in that cap and trade system, be allowed to acquire some offsets. The problem is, and of course for the globe, it's indifferent as to where those emission reductions occur. But to the people in the neighborhood where that coal-fired power plant is, it matters a lot because they're still shouldering not so much just the burdens of greenhouse gases, which are not a super direct health impact, but of the criteria pollutants, nitrogen oxides, et cetera, that do have health impacts. And so there are distributional effects. You got to think about them when you're trying to think of the solution sets and when you're putting all the science together, all the evaluation together to think about what constitutes good opportunities. Incentive structures matter, perceptions and trust matters. And again, that brings me back to the collaborative processes and how important they are. So big picture, summing it all up, as was stated by Todd at the outset, context matters. And in fact, your whole program utilizes the phrasing of context and its importance. The elements of effectiveness vary. There is not one size fits all. There's not one science decision-making procedural interface. Governance and institutions matter a lot. I didn't say much about the institutions question, but I'll stop here and add one word. You know, in some ways, many of our institutions sort of developed in the last century, and when we were engaged in ever deeper specialization, our institutions reflect that. So EPA has Office of Water, Office of Air, Office of Waste. We come into this century and we're thinking, oh, how do we put Humpty Dumpty together again and realize that all of those things are interconnected, but our institutions aren't. And so how do you transcend those silos to create that decision setting where you can have integrated decisions that take advantage of interdisciplinary thinking? And then, of course, the challenges of who, how, when, where to communicate, just as important in many cases as the science itself, as the technologies themselves. So closing here, key science needs to reinforce the point, transdisciplinary settings are super prevalent in the decision-making context. So there's career rewards in trying to engage in that transdisciplinarity, that interface of social and other sciences, the monitoring and evaluation that I talked about, what is the evidence and what outcomes are we actually perceiving, and then integrated metrics so that you sort of pull the whole picture together. None of that stuff is easy, incidentally. So putting it all together, you have interactivity, public engagement, science, communications, the policy piece, the bedrock research, the basic research, mathematics, demonstration projects, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, I'll end and turn it back to Todd and I guess Amy for comments and discussion. And I'll stop my share here.
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn. That's one disadvantage of doing it in a webinar like this. We can't see all the clapping hands, and I forgot to load up a clap track. I'm sorry about that. But the thing there, Amy will pull the weight for the rest. But that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'd like to ask Dr. Amy Pruden to respond. So Dr. Amy Pruden is a University Distinguished Professor here at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses on bringing microbial ecological perspective to understanding and advancing design and management of environmental systems. Her research has been funded by the NSF, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Water Research Foundation, the Alfred Peace Loan Foundation, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And it focuses on advancing practical means of antibiotic resistance monitoring, mitigation, and risk assessment in wastewater, recycled water, and other water systems. She currently serves on 2 National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine committees, the Environmental Health Matters Initiative and the One Health Action Collaborative. And she recently she served on the NASAM Committee on Management of Legionella in Water Systems and co-authored a consensus report in that capacity. She's authored over 175 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and is an associate editor of Environmental Science and Technology. Pruden is the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering and the Paul L. Bush Award for Innovation in Water Research, and was recently named a Fellow of the International Water Association. So Amy, thank you for your willingness to give a response and some discussion here, and I'll give you the floor.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Todd. And Lynn, that was amazing. So much of what you said, I'm wrapping my head around, and you're right, it's complex, but you gave some hope today that we can tackle that complexity. You know, we have to, and there are ways to do this. And so I was going to share a little bit about why I'm here, and then warm you up with a few questions that I had as I was listening to what you had to share with us. So as Todd shared, I'm a professor in environmental engineering, but I'm quite interdisciplinary. So I have training as a biologist and specifically as an environmental microbiologist, and looking at pathogens as environmental contaminants. And I hope I have a lot of students out there, because I definitely advertise this. And I think they're probably wondering, because this is a new thing for me, like, you know, what's Dr. Pruden up to now? So I did recently join the STEP faculty and the advisory committee, because more and more I became convinced that, you know, not only does good science inform policy, but good science is also grounded in policy to begin with. And I think that's a common evolution for scientists. We go through our careers, we start with this naive model that, oh, I do good science, and then suddenly it magically translates into policy. And that is not at all what happens. And so in my work on antibiotic resistance, you know, it's really highly interdisciplinary. And again, we're trying to think about it from an environmental perspective, basically as an environmental contaminant. And so that's been a kind of new framework, because traditionally it's thought of as a clinical problem. Like, well, if hospitals get their act together with hygiene and, you know, we stop prescribing so many antibiotics, it goes away. And but there's more to it than that. We're seeing that that's not solving the problem. There's things like discovery of new antibiotics. Why isn't that happening? You know, and then in the environmental realm, well, you know, what happens to the antibiotics when we take them, right? Well, they flush through our system, they go down the drain, they end up in sewage treatment plants, they're used in livestock facilities, they end up in rivers and streams, and along with it, the resistant bacteria. And it was great to hear you talk about complex scientific issues in a totally different context, and climate change and other examples, because actually the antibiotic resistance problem, it's been framed as a climate change type problem in recent iterations. And I've had some opportunities of late to work with international groups like the World Health Organization and the UN to try to come together. And we do run into this issue of uncertainty, right? I mean, the science will never know everything. There's always going to be these gaps. Yet if we don't take action, there's so much at stake, right? I mean, do we want to go back to a time when you couldn't take an antibiotic when you had an infection, right? Like, we're really dependent on them for our quality of life. And so I guess I I guess in a nutshell, for folks that are wondering, that's part of why I'm here is, I wish I had that training as a student from the beginning, right? Like how to ground my thinking as a scientist in this policy framework, and how to deal with uncertainty, and how to partner with stakeholders. So I've learned so much. I've had this privilege, now in my career, just kind of being thrown here and there and having the opportunities to listen to doctors and patients and farmers and wastewater treatment plant operators. And it's true, like I didn't know the words for it, but you really, when you work together and you called it joint fact finding, when you work together to find that common ground and what you agree on, little by little, you can start to move forward. So a question that I had for you, I was wondering, how do you manage scientific objectivity? So traditionally, I think the scientist model is we're just these objective computers that we don't have values or feelings. We just, we want facts, and then we put them out there and we walk away. But as we get closer and closer to the policy realm, you can get a vested interest, right? Like I'm pretty passionate about solving the antibiotic resistance problem, and I start to have some opinions about what I think we should do, but maybe that there's a danger that it can color the science, both the actual science and then maybe the trust in science. And I don't know if that's something you've run into or have thoughts about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. Love the work you're doing. Super interesting. And by the way, I love the STEM-H because the health piece is so critically important in blending that in. There's a great, and I forget the name of it, I wish I had it right at my fingertips, a great National Research Council book that they put out maybe, gosh, I don't know, 9 years ago, which was on the question of science and decision making. And I thought it was a fantastic book because it suggested that there was sort of a possible way to think of that challenge along a continuum. So at one end of the continuum, the science as the science, really trying to develop your basic science questions, the research, and then strive to make it available, and make it available perhaps in various forms that are digestible by multiple people. But you're not proposing particular solution sets. At the other end of the spectrum, that book laid out, and then there's the advocacy scientists, and there are some. That is those who have their science and good science credentials, but are really passionate about a particular issue and have made that leap to actually advocate for some climate policy or whatever it might be. And they make no pretense about it. They are there, they are scientists with science background, but oh my golly, this is a big challenge and I'm going to weigh in and here's what I think we should do. But then along that continuum, sort of gradations. So let's go to that polar bear situation and US Geological Survey. There you had multiple scientists. They were absolutely essential to our work. But in order to help us close those uncertainty, and not close them, but narrow them, they had to sit down with the decision makers so that they would have an understanding of what some of those key questions were. We had before us a draft listing decision. And when we looked at it, we're like, oh my goodness, you could drive a Mack truck through through some of the sort of claims in this thing. This is never going to stand up in court. So we had to sit down with them. But we created that wall. We sat down. What are the real problems and science questions we need some information on? But once we came to a joint agreement on that, they went their way, wall between us, absolutely no sort of interference by us. We set it up so they would come back with the reports already completed, and, we weren't going to go in and like change the wording, or, it was going to be what it was. So there's that kind of interface kind of in that middle. So I guess my comment to you would be, there are many ways of science decision-making engagement. And I think in some respects, it sort of depends on the individual scientist or the individual, say, technology developer, where you want to be along that spectrum. The other thing I would say is, often I think some people in the science community conflate talking with decision makers as advocacy. They're not the same thing. To talk with decision makers and share knowledge, or even have that dialogue on problem framing, is not the same as saying, this is the solution, go do this. So those, Amy, would be my thoughts. It's a great book. Maybe I can send the link of it to Todd, and you can share it, because it is a super, super succinct, but I thought one of the best things on the subject I've read.
That would be great. I do have a follow-up question. So if there are multiple models for how to advance science-based policy, how do you know what's the right model? And then I wonder if there's some sort of faith element, like in democracy. Often we say, okay, we have faith in democracy. That's our model of governance that most of us feel is, stable and wise. Maybe Todd put it that way. So how do we figure out the best model? And then what about when the outcome isn't what we wanted? Like, do you struggle with the winners and losers dynamic? How can that be managed?
Just super great questions. Well, first of all, I don't think there's a model. And I think, as I indicated, different decision settings invoke different kinds of relationships and models. But I will say a couple things. Scientists, the good news is, have a lot of sort of cultural elements in the world of science that are critically important to the question you asked. Transparency of the data, explanation of the research methodology, explanation of the limitations of that methodology. All of those things are super important in that science decision-making interface, because they enable even the non-scientists to say, oh, I see the limits. I see what this does and what this doesn't do. I think that's an important piece of the picture too. I often find in science reports that not explaining the limits of one's work can actually decrease trust, because invariably somebody's going to say, well, you didn't think of this, or what about that? Or whereas if you say, this is what I'm about, this is what it does, this is what it does not do. I'll give you, an example from some Nature Conservancy work. We put out a report in a science peer-reviewed published science document on natural climate solutions. That is 20 pathways to using nature to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And it was it was a sort of theoretical piece looking at vegetative types, 20 different vegetative types, using underpinning science to evaluate the extent of those vegetative systems, and then notionally what their greenhouse gas carbon sequestration could be. And they also put some cost constraints, saying, well, if you use these 20 pathways and the solution sets are under $100 a ton, here's the potential of nature to deliver those solutions. But what they didn't do was to look at, oh my goodness, people own a lot of those properties. Gee, maybe there's land tenure rights or lack of them, or maybe these are indigenous communities and maybe they don't want to manage their land that way. And so putting that stuff right in there, saying these are the limits, is super important. I think you had part B too, but I gave such a long answer, I forget part B.
Well, actually, it's funny because I was going to ask one more question before I hand it over to Corey, and you really touched on that. It's with the transparency. Like, I wonder what the tolerance is of the public in general for some margin of error or limitations to knowledge or knowledge gaps. Because I think sometimes we have this conception like, oh no, if I don't know everything, if I don't get it perfect, then we're doomed. And I mean, maybe this isn't the best example, but with the mask wearing, initially there was some mixed messaging about, whether a mask would really help or not. And then we finally landed on wear a mask, but then, then it would be referred to, well, that's not what you said originally. So again, maybe not the best example, but I wonder.
No, it's a great example. And it as soon as you brought the subject up, that popped into my mind. I think it's super challenging because on the one hand, if one discloses the complexities and underscores what we don't know, that has the potential to result in people saying, oh my gosh, you don't know anything, why should I listen to you? On the other hand, if you don't disclose those uncertainties, work in progress, then as knowledge builds, which it will, you run the risk of everybody saying, well, why should I trust you? Because you told me this yesterday and you're telling me this today. And we've seen that unfold exactly in front of our very eyes over the last year. And so, I think it's, I don't have a magic answer other than to say, I think it is important to err on the side of transparency and err on the side of what we don't know, but to strive to do it in a way that says, we do know this kernel, it's important. There are other things we don't know, but if you want to sort of err on the side of caution and safety for your own health and so forth, do this, but we'll continue to. But there is no magic way. There's fortunately a lot of researchers doing more work on this, but I would just say it's that what you're striving for is trust and uptake of knowledge, and so you've got this sort of balance on, how do you build that trust, and between the transparency, oh, there's a lot we don't know, and gosh, we forgot to tell you we didn't know that, and now we're caught changing our minds.
Well, excellent advice. I think, as is often said, that the truth will set you free, and hopefully that's what we can all come closer to. I think at this point, Todd, should we hand it over to Corey? I imagine there's some questions accumulating in the chat.
Yes, thank you both. What a rich conversation. This is fantastic. And there's some great questions that are building up there. That's wonderful. And we should get to those in a moment. I want to invite one more voice into the conversation here, as Amy already mentioned. So we're very fortunate this year to have, or this semester, to have our inaugural pair of STEP graduate scholars, certainly a program we hope to grow over time. And I see one of them, Catherine Lopez, has a question in the chat, but Corey kindly agreed to ask his question orally here to get us started on this phase. And so Corey's a PhD student, just to give some background, in environmental engineering. His research is focused on understanding and identifying sources of inorganic chemical contamination of drinking water and the policies designed to mitigate them. Specifically, his work has included the role of local health departments in the private well stewardship, the impacts of policy decisions for inorganic contaminants, and the chemistry behind leaks in copper plumbing systems. In the future, he hopes to continue his work with drinking water quality. It's also, and this is near and dear to my heart, Corey is a founding member and professional development chair of VT's new Science Policy Education and Advocacy Club, which is a student group here that's very much related to this work. And so with that, Corey, I'll give you the floor.
Thanks, Todd. And yeah, definitely thanks for taking the time talking with us today. It's really interesting to hear about the perspectives of science policy outside of classroom people who have definitely been there. So that's really cool. So it was really cool to hear about the experiences that you've had within the federal government from a really wide range of issues across kind of all different scientific areas, and some of the challenges that went along with, kind of implementing science into them. But my question is about, how is all of this experience on the side of the decision maker, or directly kind of determining policy, impacted the strategies that you use in your current work, kind of outside the government, to kind of engage them and give them information or basically to advocate effectively to where you can actually, you know, have an impact on the decisions that you're ultimately wanting to influence?
Thank you so much, Corey. Super great question. You know, my 8 years at the Interior Department, I learned more in those 8 years than in my entire life. And I like to tell people all the way from the osmo regulation of a salmon to the hydrology of a wetland, you know, up to like, how does the Congress work? So incredibly rich experience. You know, I would say that knowledge has been super helpful to me as I moved out of the government and into first being a fellow at Resources for the Future and then at Nature Conservancy in two ways. One, it gave me unbelievable exposure to all kinds of leading scientists all across the globe. And so a deep dive on things like the hydrology of a salmon or wildland fire and forest health and what we know about forest dynamics in the West and so on and so forth. So sort of subject matter knowledge, not as the expert scientist, but as a sieve who took in that information and learned from it. So I import that knowledge on a daily basis into my work at now the Nature Conservancy. But I would say almost even more so. It's why I encourage people in STEM programs and others, if they have a chance to be a fellow in some government program or whatever, really seeing, to use Todd's work, how the sausage is made. I mean, to really see the processes, because those decision processes didn't look anything like, this was in a, you know, I grew up at a time when they had civics classes. So way back then when they had civics classes, what I saw in government didn't exactly match up to the civics classes. So seeing those dynamics and the complexities and how that worked, it's what caused me to think about science and decision making, and really lies at the root of a lot of what I said in my remarks. Just understanding different decision settings mean different kinds of interfacing, you know, how people think, how they take up knowledge. So it's been invaluable.
Great. Thank you for that question, Corey, and thank you, Lynn. So we'll now pivot to the Q&A, and for those of you that are in there, you'll know it's a race between both time and who posts a question, but also some kind of fun upvoting. So if there's a question you particularly want to see answered, you can give it a thumbs up. And the first question we have here, coincidentally, is from our other fellow. See, we must have chosen well, I guess. Our other current grad fellow or grad scholar, rather, Catherine Lopez, who's also the president of the Speak Group, working with Corey on that. And so Catherine asks, have there been cases where something you were advocating for, and if Catherine will give me the leeway, maybe it's also what you've seen scientists advocate for, that have met a dead end with policymakers, and if so, how did you or they handle it?
Lots of them. Lots of such decisions. But let me give you an example, which is just an example because there are different ways to handle depending on the situation. So I was very involved in Everglades restoration. It's a very long-term proposition, very complicated. It involves restoring hydrological flows over the Everglades, but the space in which that can be done is about a third the size of what the Everglades pre-human intervention were. So there's a lot of kind of adjustments that need to be made. And the scientists were suggesting that for the water flows north of the Tamiami Trail to below the Tamiami Trail, we needed some bridging of a certain length for those flows to be sufficient really to advance the hydrological flows. The political appetite for that was weak. Not so much as a rejection of the science, but because what the scientists were saying was going to be necessary for that bridging had a huge price tag, billions of dollars. And so we were running into a complete roadblock there. And so we were at a standstill. It was either sort of well, get what the scientists say we think we need or nothing. And so we actually, we carved out an alternative. And what we did was we said, okay, let's think of this in a different way. Let's think of it in a step stair way. So let's see if we can get approval to do a 1 mile bridge. It's insufficient for the amount of hydrological flows needed, water flows south of the Tamiami Trail, but it's a start. Get the Congress to agree, put the money in that, do that. But at the same time, with an agreement that we would do the next phase of National Environmental Policy Act evaluation of then a 2 mile bridge as a follow-on. And so lo and behold, that's what we did. And lo and behold, ultimately, more of the bridging has occurred. So we just sort of redefined the situation and took a kind of compromise approach, but not leaving sight of the ultimate approach. Now, I will say that there were also situations where we just hit a dead end. I mean, look at climate. How many years have we been working on trying to get national climate policy and, sort of dead end after dead end. We're still hopeful.
Great, thank you. Next question we have is from an anonymous attendee. I think it's a great one. There's a lot of talk about promoting interdisciplinarity aimed at us graduate students, but once we graduate, finding a job where we can make an impact without tremendous specialization can be challenging. What advice do you have for students interested in careers in natural resource management or conservation? Should we go an inch wide, a mile deep?
Yeah, challenging. There's no one size fits all answer to that either. So for those who really are interested in academic career, the reward structures within the academy, the publishing processes within peer-reviewed journals often do favor the greater specialization approach. And so, if that is a type of career one wants, you may be safer to have that specialization, although that is starting to change. There are starting to be interdisciplinary journals, the purpose of which is to look at those intersections. So it is changing, and maybe even somewhat quickly. If you're really interested in going into, say, the public sector, where you're at that interface of decision making, frankly, I would say that having some interdisciplinary background can be advantageous for you. So I'll give the example. I'm an advisor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, and by its very name, it does management, engineering, technology, science, economics, throws in a little bit of law. And I will tell you that those students coming out of there are in high demand, because if you're going into an NGO, like the Nature Conservancy or some government positions, it is people who can have that systems thinking and bring that all together that, in fact, people are looking for. So it sort of depends on your career goals, but I think there's a pathway for both approaches.
That's great, thank you. And if I can shamelessly plug them in a way, that's what we're trying to do with something like STEP, right? Is you still have your disciplinary depth, but you get some breadth in this area. So that's great to hear. The next question comes from Julia Golke, who's actually the co-chair of our Policy BA stakeholder group. And Julia asks, could you talk a bit about an example of how you've dealt with scientific uncertainty in decision-making processes and how values, worldviews, experiences play into interpreting uncertainty and coming to an agreement on a course of action?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to the polar bear decision, because it was a situation of high uncertainty, which I've described a little bit, but it was also a situation that invoked deep political conflict, because there were those who absolutely did not want the bear to be listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act, because that would invoke constraints, for example, on oil and gas development in Alaska, or because they really had values and worldviews that perceived that climate was not a real phenomenon. So for some people, it was kind of interest-based disagreement about such a decision. For others, it was sort of worldview. this is, well, not precisely, but one of the reasons that we convened a group of scientists worldwide to help close those, not close, to reduce those uncertainty gaps was precisely because we knew that conflict was there. We knew we were going to be sued no matter what. We knew that the existing level of information we were utilizing in the context of those uncertainties was too broad, that people were going to say, what do you mean? There's 19 circulation models for sea ice projections and you use this one. Why did you use that one? Ultimately, what the science teams did is they used an ensemble of 19. They backcast to see which ones in that backcasting were best coincided with actual observable sea ice trends. We then utilized that to project sea ice into the future. And then the final decision reflected that. So, so we were trying to address an uncertainty, but one that was really vulnerable. Why did you use one model instead of the other 18? One of the reasons for good decision making, we undertook that work with the scientists. But part of our intent also was to get as much limiting of those uncertainties and clarity of explanation of the remaining uncertainties, so that when we were sued, and we were by 4 different entities, and when it went to court, the explanations get back to the transparency thing, Amy, were super clear. Like, here's what we do know. Here's the limitations of what we know. But here's why the best available science at this point in time is this. And this is leading to our decision. So that's a case, high uncertainty, different worldviews, different interests. But ultimately, the decision did hold up in every single one of those court cases. And I think it held up because of the good science and then the transparent explication of that science.
Great, thank you. That's great. And I think you've touched on the next question here, including the answer to this question. But Bruce Hall, who's also on our advisory, asks you to speak a little further on, if you can, on the need or willing, on the need to revise this expectation that science can answer wicked policy questions, like whether or not to list a species as endangered. We need to instead, Bruce is saying, we need to instead promote adaptive decision-making that promotes learning by doing, set goals, implement strategies, monitor, adapt, repeat, pretty much forever. That is, in this era of increasing uncertainty and dynamism, we need a new model for science and decision-making that accepts, respects failure and uncertainty. Here's what you'd have to say in response to that.
Yeah, wow. Well, you know what? I completely agree with your vision of what would be preferred. The challenge here, and this is a classic, challenge. So the Endangered Species Act is one of those iconic acts, generated 50 years ago or thereabouts. And it has its huge champions as a bedrock environmental law. And then it has its critics who have seen the law as very adversely impactful on landowners. And then there are those that are critics and have observations not unlike those you have, which is, oh, wow, this isn't really the best way to achieve habitat protection and biodiversity as the species by species kind of listing process. The challenge is, for proponents of the law, there's huge concern that opening it up for sort of reformulating how we undertake endangered species protection will open up a Pandora's box. And that instead of getting improvements, what you will get is deep limitations. Because if you open it up, then those that are critics and don't like the law at all, step in and say, well, what we need is just not to have this, or what we need is, to not have any imposition of restrictions on landowner behavior. So I guess my response to your question is, there's what would be a better way to go about this, given what we know and given dynamism of knowledge and dynamism of, you know, the habitats and so forth. But 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 the political process is such that you don't know what's going to come out at the other end of the sausage making. So not to leave you hopeless, the way I've strived to look at this issue and with others is to say, okay, let's look at the language of the law relative to the details of how it's been implemented. And is that language of the existing law such that it gives space for the kind of framing that you've suggested? And the answer to that is it does in many respects. And that, trying to think in that way allows you not to open up the whole law and then that Pandora's box, but to go back in from a practices and regulatory standpoint and try to make some adjustments that make your framing more reflective of how we implement the act.
That's great. And I see we're at time here very much. I wonder if you might permit one more, and it's partly from a very selfish perspective. I think the next question, it's a shared interest you and I have in joint fact finding. For others to know, Lynn submitted a wonderful chapter to an edited volume we did a couple of years ago on joint fact finding. And so I know it's something you've thought about quite a bit and have thoughtful things to say. But really, I take this question to more be about the institutions. And it's a real question in this eras of trust in institutions and failure of trust in institutions. And I'm curious, how you would answer. I think it's a wonderful question around who can play these important knowledge brokering and facilitative roles in these processes.
Yeah, thank you. Again, no one size fits all, no single answer. There's been a lot of work looking at this question and the role of sort of boundary organizations. Even programs like the STEP program in academic institutions. I mean, you could conceivably see some programs like that. Perhaps building knowledge around joint fact finding and then playing that role, or other entities. So there's a growing science literature looking at, well, do boundary organizations work, or can you create within existing institutions boundary processes? That's what U.S. Geological Survey has tried to do with joint fact finding, is to say, okay, here we are, U.S. government, but can we create a module that specializes in joint fact finding? So I think there are a lot of different ways to do that. Todd, I think the key is, getting those boundary institutions that allow you to work across sciences, across publics and decision makers, and sort of broker information, help to build the dialogue, which in turn then leads to some trust building. Just to close and give people some hope. I think we open up the newspaper, we see lots of conflict and think, oh my goodness, this is just so weighty and it's stressful and it's so troublesome to see the deep divides and the challenges and even the problematic tenor of discussions. And yet, in some ways, you see what you look at. And the good news is when you look out across the field, I see the efflorescence of a lot of collaborative, place-based environmental problem solving that is bringing ranchers and farmers and scientists and NGOs and tribes and many different players together in these problem solving endeavors in particular places around shared issues that people recognize. So, the water quality issues that Corey is looking at, the issues, Amy, that you're looking at, the issues that others of you in this program are looking at, where people say, oh yeah, that well water, that's a terrible problem, and it's a way of not trying to solve everything, but collaboratively say, here's a problem, we agree on it, what can we do? And the thing is, that creates a building block that often broadens into problem solving for broader and sometimes even more complicated problems. There's a guy at a group called the Blackfoot Challenge, which is a collaborative large landscape conservation endeavor in Montana. And a guy very involved in that named Jim Stone, he preaches what he calls the 80-20 rule. Let's bring ourselves all together, figure out the 80% that we agree on, do our work on that, and leave aside, exactly how we're going to deal with grizzly bears or whatever it is, for another day, but build trust. And then that's the pathway to more solutions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful way to end as well. That there is some hope out there, but it takes work. So thank you so much, Lynn. We really appreciate it, especially you humoring with that last question there over time. And thank you so much as well, of course, to Amy, to Dan, to Corey, and to everyone for joining in. This has been wonderful. So we really appreciate it, Lynn. We really appreciate everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks a bunch. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.